Have you ever opened the Bible and felt totally lost? One page, God is telling people to build an ark. A few hundred pages later, a guy named Jesus is turning water into wine. Same book, two totally different worlds. So, what's actually going on here? Is the Old Testament just outdated? Did the New Testament replace it? And why do Christians still read both? By the end of this video, you're going to understand the Bible better than 90% of people who've read it their whole lives. And it's going to be simple. No confusing theology, no boring lecture. Just the real difference, explained like a friend would explain it to you. Let's get into it. First, let's clear something up. The Old and New Testament aren't two separate books. They're two halves of one story. Think of the Bible like a movie with two parts. Part 1, the Old Testament, is the setup. It's about 39 books written over roughly 1,000 years, mostly in Hebrew. It covers creation, the first humans, the rise of a nation called Israel, kings, prophets, wars, poetry, and a whole lot of waiting. Part 2, the New Testament, is the payoff. It's 27 books written in Greek over about 50 to 100 years. It covers the life of Jesus, the birth of the church, and letters written to early Christians. Here's the simplest way to think about it. The Old Testament asks a question. The New Testament gives the answer. That question is, how can broken, imperfect people ever be made right with a perfect God? Everything in the Old Testament, every law, every sacrifice, every prophecy is building toward that answer. And Christians believe the answer shows up in one person, Jesus. Keep that in mind. It's going to make everything else click. The Old Testament basically breaks into 4 types of writing. Let's speed through them. 1. The Law. This is the first 5 books. It's the origin story, creation, Adam and Eve, Noah's flood, Abraham, and eventually Moses leading the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt. This section also gives the famous 10 Commandments and hundreds of other laws about how to live, worship, and treat each other. 2. History. This tracks the nation of Israel, kings like David and Solomon, wars, the building of a temple, and eventually the nation falling apart and its people being taken into exile. 3. Poetry and wisdom. Books like Psalms and Proverbs. This is raw human emotion, praise, grief, doubt, wisdom for everyday life. If you've ever felt like life is confusing, this section gets it. 4. The prophets. These are messengers warning Israel to get back on track. And, this is key, repeatedly predicting that God would one day send a rescuer, a Messiah. So by the end of the Old Testament, you're left with a nation waiting for the promised rescuer to show up. Then, 400 years of silence, and then the New Testament opens. The New Testament also breaks into simple categories. 1. The Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. 4 accounts of the life of Jesus, his teaching, his miracles, his death, and his resurrection. This is the heart of the whole New Testament. 2. Acts, the story of what happened right after Jesus, how a small group of his followers started the Christian movement and spread it across the ancient world. 3. The letters, also called epistles, letters written by early leaders, mostly Paul, to churches and individuals, explaining how to actually live out this new faith day to day. 4. Revelation, a symbolic prophetic vision of how everything eventually wraps up. So while the Old Testament spans thousands of years and a whole nation's history, the New Testament zooms in tightly on one person, one movement, and one message. Okay, here's where it gets interesting. Let's break down the actual differences side by side. Difference number 1, who it's about. The Old Testament centers on a nation, Israel. The New Testament centers on a person, Jesus. Difference number 2, how people relate to God. In the Old Testament, people related to God mainly through the law, following rules, offering sacrifices for wrongdoing, and going through priests. In the New Testament, that shifts. Jesus becomes the final sacrifice, so people relate to God directly through faith in him, not through rituals. Difference number 3, the tone. The Old Testament often feels intense. Justice, consequences, holiness, warnings. The New Testament leans heavily into grace, forgiveness, and love. But here's an important myth to bust. People say Old Testament God is angry, New Testament God is nice. That's actually too simple. The Old Testament is full of mercy and love, and the New Testament includes serious warnings too. It's less about two different gods and more like watching the same story shift from setup to resolution. Difference number 4, covenant. Basically, the deal with God. The Old Testament is under the Old Covenant, an agreement based on following the law. The New Testament introduces a new covenant based on what Jesus did, not on human performance. Difference number 5, language and time frame. Old Testament, Hebrew, over 1,000 years. New Testament, Greek, under 100 years. Put simply, the Old Testament shows humanity's long struggle to reach God on their own. The New Testament shows God reaching down to humanity instead. So if Jesus is the answer, why not just read the New Testament and skip the rest? Because without the Old Testament, the New Testament doesn't make sense. Here's an analogy. Imagine watching only the final 20 minutes of a movie. You'd see the climax, but you'd miss why it matters. You wouldn't know the characters, the conflict, or what's actually being resolved. The Old Testament gives you that context. It shows why humanity needed rescuing in the first place. It sets up prophecies that Jesus fulfills. It even uses stories, like a sacrificial lamb protecting people from judgment, that suddenly make total sense once you see Jesus described the exact same way. That's why Jesus himself in the New Testament quotes the Old Testament constantly. He didn't see himself as replacing it. He said he came to fulfill it. So the two testaments aren't in competition. They're one continuous story. Old Testament, something is broken and help is coming. New Testament, help has arrived. Let's lock this in with a fast recap. Old Testament, 39 books. The setup, the nation of Israel, the law, the wait for a rescuer. New Testament, 27 books. The payoff, the life of Jesus, the birth of the church. Old Testament asks the question. New Testament gives the answer. Different covenant, different focus, but one unified story, not two separate ones. Once you see the Bible this way, not as a confusing ancient book, but as a two-part story building to one climax, it stops feeling intimidating and starts feeling like something you can actually follow.